Rising majestically where the Chesapeake Bay meets the Atlantic Ocean, Fort Monroe stands not merely as a military installation, but as a profound, tangible monument to American history, often referred to as Freedom's Fortress. Its massive stone ramparts and intricate moats enclose 7 centuries of strategic military thought, dating back to the earliest colonial defenses. The fort's official construction began in 1819, establishing it as the largest stone fort ever built in the United States. Designed by the visionary French engineer Simon Bernard, a veteran of Napoleon's staff, the fort was a cornerstone of the nation's coastal defense system. Its hexagonal shape, bristling with cannon emplacements, and surrounding a vast, open parade ground, represented the cutting edge of military engineering in the early 19th century. Yet its enduring significance transcends its architecture. Fort Monroe is a place where the foundational principles of the nation were brutally tested and redefined. It was here, during the Civil War, that Union Major General Benjamin Butler made his crucial contraband decision in 1861, refusing to return 3 escaped enslaved men to their Confederate owners, effectively declaring them contraband of war. This act instantly transformed the fort into a beacon of emancipation, turning the tide for thousands seeking freedom, and cementing its legacy as the birthplace of Black Americans' journey toward military and civic equality. For decades after the war, the fort remained a critical army post, a training ground, and a sentinel watching over the busy maritime traffic entering Hampton Roads. While its military role persisted through both world wars and into the 21st century, the fort's stoic, enduring presence has always concealed a deeper, more emotional reality. A place built on centuries of bloodshed, sacrifice, and the profound, often tragic, cost of duty. It is perhaps inevitable that a few of the souls who served within its walls never truly left. The history etched into the very stones of the ramparts and the deep shadow cast by the towering artillery observation post, home to the fort's ancient bell, would set the stage for one of the most persistent and chilling mysteries in American military lore. The persistent, ghostly presence that continues to haunt the highest point of Freedom's Fortress. The spectral occurrences were not an immediate byproduct of the fort's construction, but rather began filtering into the official records and barracks gossip in the waning decades of the 19th century. By the 1890s, Fort Monroe was a well-established army center, a world of rigid routine and pragmatic discipline. Yet, beneath this veneer of order, a growing dread began to take hold among the enlisted men. The first account centered not on a full apparition, but on a terrifying sound, a single, unmistakable toll of the bell in the tower, often heard in the deepest, most desolate hours of the night. This bell, meant to signal emergencies, drills, or the call to prayer, was strictly controlled. Guards were often posted nearby, and the clapper was known to be secured to prevent accidental ringing. On a particularly thick, foggy night late in 1893, Private Thomas O'Malley was on patrol near the tower when the silence was shattered by a resounding dong. He immediately reported an intruder, convinced a prankster had slipped past the night watch. A search party was assembled, scaling the narrow, winding steps of the tower. They found the heavy iron door locked from the outside, the bell and its mechanism undisturbed, and absolutely no one inside. The chilling part? O'Malley swore the sound had come directly from the bell, not just an echo from the fog, and he was the first of many to experience the unsettling phenomenon. The unexplainable ringing quickly evolved from a local curiosity into a genuine source of terror. The occurrences continued with a terrifying consistency, almost always around 3 a.m. It wasn't just the bell. Watchmen began reporting distinct but fleeting auditory anomalies emanating from the empty tower. The soft, rhythmic creak of boot leather on the wooden steps, the muffled sound of a man clearing his throat, or even a low, despairing sigh carried on the coastal breeze. The guards, seasoned veterans or young recruits alike, initially dismissed these sounds as trickery of the wind or the settling of the old structure, but soon recognized a pattern that defied natural explanation. One night in 1905, Sergeant Alastair Cole, a man known for his unflappable demeanor, was performing a routine inspection when he heard the distinct sound of someone loading an old-style rifle directly above him. He shouted an order to identify themselves, drawing his sidearm, but the only response was a sudden, profound drop in temperature and the unmistakable scent of burning sulfur before the air cleared entirely. Cole later reported that he could hear the sound retreat, not by descending the stairs, but by simply vanishing at the top landing. It became an unofficial rule among the fort's garrison. No soldier was to approach the bell tower alone after midnight. The feeling was not that of being watched, but of intruding upon a lonely vigil. The ghost, whatever it was claiming its domain. The heart of the haunting, the persistent sound that defined the Fort Monroe specter, was the bell itself. The mystery was twofold. The bell was enormous, requiring significant effort to move its clapper, and access to the tower's mechanism was, at all times, secured. Yet the deep, resonating gong would pierce the coastal fog with unnerving regularity. For the garrison, the sound was maddening because it carried none of the expected acoustic properties of a manually rung bell. Instead of a strong, followed by a vibrating decay, the sound was often described as a single, melancholy thud. A sound that was immediate and then instantly muffled, as if the energy of the strike was violently cut short. Military engineers and local civilian contractors were called in on multiple occasions throughout the early 1900s to examine the bell and the tower's structure. They meticulously checked for stress fractures, wind vibration susceptibility, and even nesting birds large enough to potentially shift the mechanism. The conclusion was always the same. The bell was structurally sound, the clapper secured, and the tower was impervious to wind-induced ringing. There was simply no physical explanation for the repeated tolls. It led to the fearful, quiet acceptance that the force operating the bell was not of this world. The ringing wasn't a warning. It was a dirge, an audible cry of distress from the high stone perch. The auditory terror escalated into visual confirmation around 1912, solidifying the folklore. It was on a clear, moonless night that Corporal Eli Vance claimed to have seen the ghost. He was walking the perimeter near the tower when he glanced up, and there, silhouetted against the night sky on the narrow observation balcony, stood a figure. It was unquestionably a man in a military uniform, though the cut of the coat and the style of the cap looked strangely dated, belonging to a previous generation of the fort's occupants. Corporal Vance noted the uniform was a dark blue, almost black in the moonlight, and seemed to possess an unnatural stillness. The figure was not moving or swaying, it was simply standing. Vance froze, shouting, "Halt! Who goes there?" The figure did not respond, nor did it turn its head. Instead, it slowly raised its arm in a gesture that was ambiguous. Was it pointing, or was it making a sign of farewell? As the corporal drew his rifle, a sharp, cold wind, uncorrelated with the general coastal breeze, swirled around the base of the tower, and the figure dissolved entirely, not fading, but simply becoming transparent, merging back into the darkness of the stone. Vance's report was initially treated as a case of extreme exhaustion, but the description of the uniform quickly spread, matching descriptions given by others who had experienced brief, fleeting glimpses. The consensus emerged. The ghost was a soldier from the Civil War or Reconstruction era, a sentinel who refused to stand down. The sightings and the persistent ringing soon demanded an explanation rooted in the fort's rich and often painful history. Through the meticulous scouring of early garrison records, one name began to surface with compelling regularity in proximity to the tower: Private Henry Miller. The official records indicate Miller was stationed at Fort Monroe in 1867, shortly after the Civil War ended. He was a promising young soldier from Virginia, but his service was marred by a critical, catastrophic lapse in judgment. Miller was assigned as the primary watchman for the massive ordnance depot located not far from the bell tower. On a stormy night, overcome by exhaustion or perhaps by the cheap liquor he was known to sometimes secretly consume, Miller abandoned his post. During his absence, a fire, its origin never fully determined, broke out in the depot, resulting in the catastrophic loss of valuable supplies and the serious injury of several men attempting to fight the blaze. This dereliction of duty was not just a minor infraction. It was an act that was considered tantamount to treason during the volatile post-war period. Following Corporal Vance's sighting of the strangely dressed soldier on the bell tower's balcony, the phenomenon shifted from frightening sounds to tangible, physical experiences that terrified the personnel. The areas around the tower and the parade ground adjacent to it became notorious for unexplained cold spots, even on the warmest summer nights. Sentries reported walking their patrols and suddenly hitting a wall of absolute, profound cold, a chilling sensation that cut right through their thick woolen uniforms and lasted only a few steps before they were back in the warm coastal air. This wasn't merely a draft. The temperature drop was often accompanied by a distinct, crushing feeling of dread. a sense of overwhelming failure and sorrow that made the bravest soldiers momentarily freeze in place. One such incident, recorded unofficially in a 1920 diary of a commanding officer, detailed the experience of Private Jacob Hayes. Hayes was conducting a check on the ordnance storage shed near the base of the tower when he felt the characteristic cold spot. He braced himself, expecting the usual wave of melancholy, but this time it was different. He heard a whisper, faint and dry, right next to his ear, though no one was within yards of him. The sound was too indistinct to form words, but the tone was undeniably one of bitter self-reproach, a mournful, guttural sound of a man reliving a profound mistake. Hayes later wrote that he didn't run, but rather backed away slowly, his rifle shaking, because he had the terrifying realization that he was not being haunted by a malevolent entity, but by a soul in constant, acute despair. The personnel now understood that the ghostly sentinel was not guarding the fort against them, but was perpetually imprisoned by his own guilt, replaying his fateful error for eternity. The historical context provided by the records of Private Henry Miller, the watchman who abandoned his post in 1867, offered the only rational anchor for the growing supernatural fear. The records paint a grim picture of military justice. Miller was immediately arrested after the fire in the Ordnance Depot and subjected to a swift and brutal court-martial. In the post-Civil War environment, where maintaining discipline and securing federal assets was paramount, his dereliction was considered unforgivable. He was not only found guilty but publicly disgraced. The court's sentence was harsh, a dishonorable discharge followed by a lengthy prison term in the dry Tortugas. The shame, however, proved a heavier burden than the legal punishment. According to the few handwritten notes found in the archives, Miller was held in a temporary cell within the fort while awaiting transport. Overcome by the condemnation of his comrades, the magnitude of his failure, and the devastating loss of honor, Private Miller tragically took his own life before he could be escorted to his punishment. His body was quietly and quickly removed, and the incident was officially glossed over to prevent scandal. The specific location of his final resting place remains a mystery, adding a final layer to his tragic narrative. Yet his final days within the fort, spent consumed by guilt, provided the heartbreaking motive for the haunting. A soul so tied to his failure that he cannot leave the site of his deepest shame. The question among the fort's personnel became not who was haunting the tower, but why he remained tethered to this specific structure by the water's edge. The theory embraced by the fort's unofficial storytellers is that Private Miller is locked in a perpetual loop of duty and failure. The bell tower, being the highest point, was the ultimate observation post, symbolizing the very vigilance he failed to maintain. It is believed that the ghost of Henry Miller remains at his post in a futile attempt to redeem his honor. He constantly patrols the area he abandoned, forever listening for a signal he missed, or perhaps tolling the bell himself as a belated, desperate alarm. This theory explains the utter despair felt by those who encounter him. It is the raw, emotional residue of a man who died believing he failed his country and his fellow soldiers. The restless spirit of Private Miller is not a monster. He is a permanent sentinel, a spectral figure eternally paying the ultimate price for one moment of human frailty at freedom's fortress. For those stationed at Fort Monroe, the sight of Private Miller's spectral figure was terrifying, but it was the sound of his haunting that truly defined the mystery and eroded their sense of security. The bell in the tower was a monstrous artifact, a heavy brass hemisphere designed to project sound across miles of water. The sheer energy required to make its clapper swing demanded deliberate, significant manual force. Yet the bell would ring, and it rang when it shouldn't. The typical manifestation was not a continuous peal, but a single, authoritative gong, a sound that could wake the entire garrison but was often too brief to be traced. It was invariably reported on the nights of heavy fog, or when a storm was brewing over the Atlantic, as if the spirit itself was sensitive to the disruption of the natural order. What baffled engineers and commanding officers for decades was the quality of the sound. Witnesses consistently reported that the toll lacked the prolonged, vibrant decay characteristic of a normal bell ringing. It was loud, sharp, and then immediately dead, as if the sound waves were absorbed by an unseen force the moment they left the bronze. It was the sound of a chime that was desperately trying to be heard, yet simultaneously muted by its own sorrow. Multiple attempts were made to mechanically prevent the ringing. After the initial reports in the 1890s, the Army ordered that the bell's heavy rope be completely removed, and the clapper itself was secured with iron shackles, padlocked and sealed with military wax. The assumption was that even if an intruder managed to climb the tower undetected, they could not bypass the security measures without leaving physical evidence. Yet the ringing continued. The bell tolled through the locked shackles. This defiance of physics became the ghost's signature act, a palpable, audible proof that the events were not the product of wind, pranksters, or structural fatigue. The psychological effect on the troops was profound. The bell was meant to signify alertness, alarm, or official ceremony. But when it rang inexplicably at 3 a.m., it signaled only the deep-seated sorrow of the post. The sound became a morbid time marker. Soldiers would lie awake, listening through the barracks walls, waiting for the one single dreadful sound that confirmed they were sharing their duty with a restless, heartbroken soul. It was a haunting that demanded attention, a relentless reminder of military failure echoing through the decades. The personnel ceased thinking of it as the fort bell. It was simply Miller's toll. It was rumored among the older veterans that the spirit only manifested the ringing when some form of danger approached the fort, attempting to redeem himself by warning a generation of soldiers who were not his own. This theory was never officially confirmed, but it added a layer of tragic nobility to Private Miller's spectral duty. Whether he was seeking to warn the living or merely trapped in the sound of his greatest mistake, the echoing gong from the unringable bell tower remains the most powerful and enduring manifestation of the Fort Monroe ghost. The continuous, unexplainable nature of the ringing eventually drew attention beyond the garrison itself. While officers were obligated to be skeptical, blaming coastal moisture, faulty mechanisms, or drunken tailies, the sheer volume and consistency of the reports made dismissal impossible. Civilian engineering teams were brought in, and even early members of the Society for Psychical Research occasionally visited the fort under the guise of historical study. The skeptics focused on the unique acoustic conditions of the hexagonal stone fortress. They argued that extreme temperature shifts or high winds funneled through the unique architecture could vibrate the structure in a way that moved the massive clapper, despite the locks. Yet time and again, the bell would toll on calm, clear nights. The believers, conversely, pointed to the tragic history of Private Miller and the sheer impossibility of the sound given the security measures. For them, the bell was a historical footnote transformed into a supernatural communication device. The investigation ultimately failed to provide a definitive answer, leaving the garrison with a chilling choice. Either the laws of physics were temporarily suspended over the bell tower, or they were sharing their historic post with the eternal, guilt-ridden echo of a dishonored sentinel. While the spectral toll of the bell was the ghost's audible signature, the most profound and terrifying confirmations of the haunting were the fleeting, visual sightings of the soldier himself. These sightings, though rare, were always precise, lending an eerie credibility to the identity woven from the fort's grim past, Private Henry Miller. The soldier was never seen clearly in broad daylight, but always in the deep shadows of the pre-dawn hours or under the pale, watery moonlight filtering through the coastal fog. The key to identifying him lay in his distinct military attire. Eyewitness accounts, spanning decades and different generations of soldiers, consistently described a uniform that was unmistakably not contemporary. The apparition wore a dark, heavy coat, often described as an earlier, more rigid style of the U.S. Army enlisted man's frock coat, the kind common during the Reconstruction era of the late 1860s. Instead of the brightly polished brass of modern buttons, his were described as dull, and the cloth itself appeared threadbare and heavy, a profound contrast to the pristine uniforms worn by the soldiers who glimpsed him. The cap was high and rigid, reminiscent of a kepi, casting a deep shadow over his face, which was invariably obscured by distance or darkness. One of the most detailed sightings was provided in 1943 by a young recruit, Private John Sullivan, who was pulling late-night barracks duty during World War II. He was walking past the bell tower when he saw a figure standing motionless near the base, staring up at the stone structure. Sullivan, assuming it was a fellow soldier, challenged him. The figure slowly turned its head, and Sullivan was struck by the absence of color. The man was rendered in shades of gray and deep blue, almost like an old daguerreotype brought to life. He distinctly noted the man's trousers were tucked into heavy, old-fashioned gaiters, or boots that went up past the ankle, a style long since abandoned by the military. The most unnerving detail, however, was the expression, or lack thereof, on the soldier's face. Multiple witnesses agreed that the apparition carried an overwhelming aura of despair and exhaustion. His shoulders were slumped. His posture was not the rigid, proud stance of a sentinel, but the defeated slump of a man burdened by insurmountable grief. When sighted, the phantom was typically not doing anything. He was simply standing guard or staring out to sea, as if perpetually waiting for a ship that would never arrive, or searching for an enemy that had already been defeated. The appearances were also often tied to the specific action that led to Private Miller's ruin. Occasionally, the ghost would be seen frantically looking around, his movements quick and jerky, as if searching for something he had lost, presumably the fire that consumed the ordnance depot in his fateful moment of negligence. These visual manifestations solidified the identity of the bell tower ghost. He was not a generic spirit, but the specific, anguished echo of Private Henry Miller, eternally dressed in the uniform of his shame, bound to his post by a haunting sense of unfulfilled duty. The sight was always brief, often lasting only a second or two before the figure would melt back into the shadows or vanish in a sudden blast of icy air. Leaving the observer alone, shaken and certain they had witnessed a profound tragedy given form. The visual confirmation of the ghost's historical uniform propelled the search for a specific, tragic figure within the fort's voluminous archives. The sheer heartbreak and profound guilt radiating from the apparition suggested a death tied not merely to war, but to a personal, shattering failure. The meticulous scouring of late 19th century garrison records yielded a compelling and deeply sorrowful candidate, Private Henry Miller. Private Miller was stationed at Fort Monroe in 1867, a crucial and politically charged period following the close of the Civil War. Though a period of transition, the fort remained an active and strategically vital military hub. Miller, a young man from the region, was entrusted with the duty of night watchman over the fort's primary ordnance depot. This assignment, while seeming mundane, was a position of immense responsibility. The depot housed vital ammunition and supplies that protected the fort and the crucial shipping lanes of Hampton roads. However, on a particularly volatile, stormy evening in the late fall, Private Miller was alleged to have committed the ultimate military sin, dereliction of duty. Accounts suggest that, worn down by ceaseless routine and the fort's pervasive isolation, or perhaps, as hinted at in quiet reports, having succumbed to a moment of reckless insobriety, Miller abandoned his post. He left the depot unattended, a critical breach of his oath. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. While Miller was away, a fierce fire broke out in the depot. The origin was later attributed to an electrical malfunction, but its devastation was magnified tenfold by the lack of a watchman to give the immediate alarm. The subsequent blaze raged, destroying thousands of dollars in military assets, and more tragically, severely injuring several men who rushed in to fight the uncontrolled inferno. The fort's defenses were compromised, and the immediate area was thrown into chaos. Private Miller's mistake was seen not just as a simple lapse, but as a profound act of betrayal against his comrades and his command. In the rigid world of post-war military honor, his action was an unpardonable stain on the integrity of the fort. This tragic incident, a singular moment of human weakness leading to devastating loss, provided the only truly plausible route for a haunting defined by utter remorse. The historical record suggests that the ghost haunting the bell tower is not a hero guarding his post, but a disgraced man forever standing watch over the tragedy he wrought, trapped in the loop of the duty he failed to perform. The reaction from the fort's command to the depot fire and Miller's role was swift and severe. Private Miller was immediately arrested and subjected to a hasty court-martial. The proceedings were less about finding truth and more about delivering swift, exemplary justice to maintain discipline in a time of fragile peace. The verdict was a foregone conclusion: guilty. The condemnation was crushing. His punishment was an immediate dishonorable discharge, the official stripping away of his name and honor, followed by imprisonment. This loss of honor, however, was what sealed his fate. The shame and guilt, coupled with the realization that his single moment of failure had cost lives and materiel, became an unbearable psychological weight. He was confined to a temporary cell within the fort while awaiting transfer to his prison detail. It was here, overwhelmed by the condemnation of his fellow soldiers and the weight of his own conscience, that the young private tragically ended his own life. The military disposed of the body quietly, seeking to suppress the scandal. But the spirit of Henry Miller, forever bound to the bell tower and the memory of his shame, was not so easily dismissed. Following the catastrophic fire in the Ordnance Depot, the fate of Private Henry Miller was sealed not by the military court, but by his own crushing conscience. His crime, abandoning his post, was, in the context of Fort Monroe in 1867, viewed as the ultimate act of betrayal. It wasn't simply a violation of rules. It was a profound breach of the shared responsibility that bound the garrison together. The knowledge that his single moment of weakness, whether induced by fatigue, liquor, or simple recklessness, had led to the loss of irreplaceable supplies and the serious injury of his comrades became an unbearable burden. The military justice system moved quickly. Miller's court-martial delivered a verdict of guilty and sentenced him to a dishonorable discharge and prison time. However, the true sentence was self-inflicted. While awaiting transfer to his confinement facility, Miller was held in a stark, temporary cell within the fort's confines. It was here, surrounded by the echoing routines of the garrison he had disgraced, that his despair deepened into absolute torment. His mental state was not one of anger or defiance, but of overwhelming, consuming shame. In the 19th century military ethos, a dishonorable discharge was a condemnation that followed a man for life, extinguishing his civic identity and stripping him of all personal honor. For a young soldier, the loss of his reputation was worse than death. The whispers he heard in the fort corridors were not of his crime, but of his cowardice. He believed he had failed his entire generation, and worse, he had failed the very ideals of duty that freedom's fortress represented. Miller's death was a desperate and lonely act, a final attempt to escape the condemnation and the crushing weight of his guilt. He didn't just end his life, he tried to end the shame. But his suicide, a deeply tragic act, only cemented his eternal attachment to the scene of his failure. The act, committed within the fort's boundaries, ensured that his anguished soul could find no rest. The phantom that now patrols the bell tower is believed to be the projection of this final, desperate state. He is trapped, forever replaying the trauma, eternally vigilant for the warning he missed. His mournful bell tolls are not meant to frighten the living, but to express the unrelenting, soundless plea of a soldier seeking redemption he can never achieve. He is a sentinel perpetually standing his final, forlorn post, hoping to undo the past, but only succeeding in becoming a permanent, heartbreaking fixture of the fort's tragic history. His haunting is a requiem for a life consumed by the loss of honor and a permanent reminder that some wounds, even those to the soul, never truly heal. The psychological profile of the haunting perfectly explains the spirit's tethering to the bell tower. The tower, the ultimate watch post, represents the duty Miller failed to uphold. He is compelled to stand there, year after year, century after century, a figure of eternal vigilance. The proximity to the sea, the vast, restless Atlantic, mirrors the boundless nature of his despair. He is permanently anchored to the site of his shame, a silent guardian over a coastline he once put in jeopardy. The bell tower ghost of Fort Monroe is therefore not a malicious spirit, but a lonely figure whose only existence is the endless, futile hope of earning back the honor he lost in a moment of human frailty. The mystery of the bell tower ghost ceased to be about who he was, and instead centered on the profoundly tragic question of why he remained. The psychological ties binding the spirit of Private Henry Miller to Fort Monroe were far stronger than any physical restraints. His haunting is not a punishment inflicted by others, but a self-imposed sentence fueled by unbearable guilt and a relentless need for redemption. The emotional anchor tethering Miller to the fort is the concept of honor lost. In the post-Civil War military, a soldier's identity was inextricably linked to his duty and his word. By abandoning his post and subsequently causing catastrophic damage and injury, Miller shattered his personal honor. His final act of despair, suicide, was a desperate attempt to stop the pain, but tragically it only solidified his attachment to the scene of his failure. Because he died before his dishonorable discharge could be fully processed, and before he could face the legal consequences, his spirit is believed to be trapped in an eternal state of transition, unable to move on without resolving the profound moral debt he believes he owes. The bell tower, towering over the fort, became the focal point of this torment. It was the highest observation post, the symbolic seat of the vigilance he failed to maintain. The spirit of Miller is compelled to stand eternal guard there, forever compensating for the moment he slipped away. His spectral pacing, his mournful bell tolls, and his desolate sightings are all manifestations of this ceaseless, futile duty. He is searching, not for an intruder, but for the chance to rewind time, to ring the alarm he missed, and to earn back the respect he valued more than his life. Furthermore, the fort's unique geography plays a role. Surrounded on three sides by the vast, restless Atlantic Ocean and the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, the location itself is symbolic. The relentless churning of the tide mirrors the restless churning of his soul. The vastness of the water represents the enormity of his failure, a duty that extended beyond the stone walls to protect the crucial coastal entryway. Miller's ghost is often seen staring out to sea, perhaps looking for the phantom ship that would have taken him to prison, or perhaps simply contemplating the vast, unchangeable consequences of his single moment of human weakness. He is a sentinel who never stood down, because the weight of his failure gave him a permanent post. This deep emotional tie is why the atmosphere around the tower is defined by profound sorrow rather than malice. Those who encounter the ghost report feeling immense dread and melancholy, not fear of a monster, but empathy for a man in endless torment. The haunting of Fort Monroe is therefore a heartbreaking historical footnote given supernatural form, a perpetual reminder that the scars of dishonor can bind a soul more tightly than any chain. The continuous, unexplainable nature of the haunting eventually drew attention beyond the garrison itself, while officers were obligated to be skeptical, blaming coastal moisture, faulty mechanisms, or drunken tailies. The sheer volume and consistency of the reports made dismissal impossible. Civilian engineering teams were brought in to check the bell's mechanism, and early members of the Society for Psychical Research occasionally visited the fort under the guise of historical study. The haunting forces a confrontation between the pragmatic world of military order and the profound mystery of the human spirit. The investigations always end the same way, with no physical explanation, leaving the fort personnel to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that Private Miller's guilt is a tangible presence, a permanent, sorrowful sentinel at freedom's fortress. For over a century, the mysterious bell tower ghost has forced a confrontation between the pragmatic, rule-bound world of the U.S. Army and the persistent, unyielding nature of the supernatural. The official response to the repeated sightings and inexplicable ringing was always one of stern skepticism. Military command could not and would not officially acknowledge a ghost. Yet, the sheer volume and chilling consistency of the reports, especially those from sober, reliable officers, necessitated numerous attempts to rationalize the phenomena. Engineers were routinely ordered to inspect the bell tower. They searched meticulously for structural flaws, hairline cracks that might vibrate in the wind, peculiar acoustics that distorted sound, or mechanical defects in the bell itself. The fort's unique hexagonal shape and its exposure to the sea were often cited as the potential source of acoustic anomalies. Yet, their investigations invariably concluded with a perplexing contradiction. The building was sound, the bell was secured, and there was no physical mechanism to account for the single, resonant gong that pierced the night. Every attempt to logically explain the bell's toll was met with another unexplainable ringing on a calm, windless night, confirming to the garrison that the force at work was not atmospheric. Unofficially, however, the response was one of terrified belief. The soldiers living within the fort's ramparts traded whispered stories of Private Miller, adding new, chilling details with each passing decade. The younger recruits, fresh from training, would be quietly cautioned by their sergeants to avoid the tower after midnight. This was the unofficial investigation, a living oral tradition passed down through the ranks, confirming the ghostly sentinel's presence. Soldiers became adept at detecting the ghost's presence. The sudden, icy drop in temperature, the faint smell of sulfur or old gunpowder, and the overwhelming feeling of acute personal failure that sometimes washed over the area near the old ordnance depot. In the late 20th century, the era of professional paranormal investigation brought new tools to the centuries-old mystery. Teams armed with electromagnetic field, EMF detectors, infrared cameras, and electronic voice phenomena, EMF recorders began seeking permission to study the historical site. While the Army remained officially neutral, the fort's eventual transition to a national monument opened the doors to these civilian ghost hunters. The EVP sessions proved particularly compelling. Investigators claimed to have recorded faint, deep whispers near the tower, sounds too low to be human, but clearly capturing the essence of desperation and military terminology, such as a single, choked utterance that sounded like post. The EMF detectors would often spike wildly near the sealed clock mechanism, sometimes coinciding with the cold spots reported by the original soldiers 100 years earlier. These modern attempts failed to definitively prove the existence of the ghost, but they succeeded in providing a new, high-tech validation of the subjective experiences of the fort's personnel. The investigators' findings merely confirmed what the soldiers already knew. Private Miller was a perpetual entity, an echo of failure bound to the stone citadel. The mystery of the bell tower ghost remains unsolved, a perfect synthesis of tragic human history and enduring supernatural presence. While official inquiries focused on structural anomalies and acoustic distortions, the true, chilling evidence of the bell tower ghost resided in the numerous, consistent, and deeply personal anecdotes shared among those who served within the fort's cold stone walls. These were not the sensationalized tales of tourists, but the quiet, terrified confessions of seasoned military personnel whose routines were shattered by inexplicable encounters. One of the most common experiences was the sudden, oppressive feeling of dread. Sergeant Elias Vance, who served a tour in the 1960s, recalled a patrol near the old battery emplacements by the water's edge. He described walking from the normal, humid coastal air into a pocket of absolute psychological failure. He swore that for a few seconds, he was overwhelmed by the conviction that he had betrayed his entire unit. It wasn't fear, it was just shame, he later recounted. The feeling was so strong I nearly dropped my sidearm. It felt like someone else's desperate grief was trying to climb into my skin. This acute emotional transference became a hallmark of Private Miller's presence. Another recurring anecdote centered on the cold spots. Unlike simple drafts, these were pockets of frigid air that seemed to have defined borders. During the blistering summer of 1985, Captain Maria Lopez was crossing the parade ground late at night when she walked through an area so cold that she instinctively wrapped her arms around herself. When she looked down, she claimed she could see her breath. The cold vanished as suddenly as it appeared, but not before she felt a distinct, gentle pressure, like a hand on her shoulder. When she wheeled around, there was nothing but the shadow of the bell tower, and a faint, residual smell that she identified as stagnant water and old, wet wool. Perhaps the most visceral accounts involved the auditory hallucinations. While the bell's toll was the main event, sometimes the soldiers heard much closer sounds. Private First Class David Chin, on watch duty in the 1990s, reported hearing the sound of a man quietly weeping. The sound was not loud, but heartbreakingly close, emanating from the empty upper floors of the tower. He described the sound as being punctuated by soft, rhythmic creaking, the sound of boot leather on old wooden stairs. Chin spent the rest of his shift standing paralyzed, unable to retreat but terrified to climb the stairs, convinced the sound of despair was beckoning him toward the source of the haunting. These chilling reports, passed down from one generation of soldiers to the next, transformed Private Miller from a historical record into a living, sorrowful presence. The soldiers didn't just believe in the bell tower ghost. They knew him. They knew his crippling shame, his cold, his scent, and his endless, lonely patrol. His haunting became a sobering lesson woven into the fort's fabric, a palpable reminder of the profound price paid for a moment of human frailty and the eternal consequence of losing one's honor. When Fort Monroe was decommissioned as an active military installation and transitioned into a national monument in the early 21st century, the doors, both literal and metaphorical, were open to a new type of pilgrim, the paranormal investigator. Modern ghost hunters, armed not with military orders but with sophisticated electronics, descended upon the historic site, eager to apply high-tech rigor to the centuries-old legend of Private Miller. They were seeking not to rationalize the haunting, but to prove it, using methods that the 19th century garrison could never have imagined. The primary tools brought to bear against the mystery were electromagnetic field EMF detectors. These devices measure fluctuations in the electromagnetic energy that skeptics attribute to wiring or appliances, but believers correlate with the energy left behind by spirits. Teams routinely recorded massive spikes in EMF readings around the bell tower, particularly on the winding wooden staircase and near the old ordnance depot location. These energy surges were often reported to coincide precisely with the sudden, localized cold spots that the soldiers had complained about for decades, suggesting a correlation between the ghostly presence and measurable energy displacement. Perhaps the most compelling evidence came from electronic voice phenomena, EVP, recordings. This technique involves recording silence using highly sensitive digital recorders, then listening for anomalous sounds or voices that are inaudible to the human ear at the time of recording. Investigators spent countless hours in the dark tower, whispering questions to the silence. Their efforts yielded fascinating, if inconclusive, results. Numerous recordings captured faint, deep utterances, sounds too guttural and low to be natural human voices. On one famous 2018 recording, allegedly captured near the bell mechanism, an investigator asked, "Why are you here?" The playback revealed a faint, choked whisper that sounded eerily like, "Post." Failed. On another occasion, a recording near the base of the tower captured a distinct sound that sounded precisely like an old-fashioned rifle being cocked. An auditory event that perfectly mirrored Sergeant Cole's terrifying report from over a century prior. Infrared and thermal cameras were also deployed, continuously monitoring the tower's narrow observation balcony where the apparition was most frequently sighted. While full-body apparitions remained elusive, the cameras occasionally registered inexplicable thermal anomalies. Brief, human-shaped patches of extreme cold that would appear and vanish instantaneously, sometimes coinciding with a spike in the EMF detector. These findings provided the most tangible link yet between the soldiers' anecdotal fear and measurable scientific data. For the paranormal community, these high-tech findings didn't just validate the fort's haunting. They transformed Private Henry Miller into one of the most thoroughly documented emotional tethers in American spectral lore. He became the Phantom Sentinel, whose enduring sorrow could be measured, recorded, and analyzed, forever bridging the tragic gap between the fort's long, documented history and its chilling, ongoing supernatural reality. After decades of sightings, unexplainable bell tolls, and high-tech paranormal recordings, the ultimate question surrounding Private Henry Miller remained an emotional and philosophical one. What is the ghost's motivation? Is the spectral sentinel a harbinger of danger, a victim trapped in endless lament, or a soul actively searching for the peace that eluded him in life? The nature of the encounters suggests that his presence is a complex mixture of all three. One theory, popular among the fort's former military personnel, is that Miller is eternally trying to fulfill the duty he failed. In this view, his intermittent bell tolls and brief apparitions are a warning. He is compelled to stand watch and sound the alarm, desperately trying to compensate for the catastrophic lapse that defined his life. Soldiers often noted that the phenomena seemed to increase during bad weather or times of military stress, suggesting the spirit was attempting to guard his post against a perceived, imminent threat. He is an eternal sentinel, whose sole, futile purpose is to protect the fort he once imperiled. However, the overwhelming feeling reported by witnesses, the acute sensation of dread and crushing shame, points toward the haunting being a perpetual lament. Miller's ghost is less about warning others and more about replaying his own torment. He is a soul trapped in a loop of failure, forced to remain at the site of his deepest regret. His appearance is that of a man burdened by insurmountable grief, and the atmosphere around the bell tower is thick with his sorrow. The low, weeping sounds allegedly captured on EVP recorders are the sounds of a spirit perpetually mourning the loss of his honor, a wound that was never allowed to heal in life. The haunting is, in this sense, a permanent, visible scar on the fort's history, a requiem for a life consumed by guilt. Finally, there is the heartbreaking possibility that the spirit of Private Miller is actively searching for peace. His movements, often described as slow and aimless, particularly when staring out at the sea, suggest a soul searching for an exit, a release from his post. Perhaps his bell tolls are not warnings but desperate cries for help. If someone could somehow acknowledge his sacrifice, forgive his failure, or simply render the proper military honors he was denied in his dishonorable death, his endless vigil might finally end. The ghost may be waiting for a living person to complete the final, respectful rites that would allow him to lay down his arms and leave freedom's fortress for good. Ultimately, the bell tower ghost stands as a tragic monument to the unbreakable bond between a soldier and his honor. Whether he warns, laments, or searches, his presence is a poignant reminder that the weight of a guilty conscience can be a more powerful, enduring prison than any stone fortress could ever be. His endless vigil encapsulates the deep, emotional cost of the nation's military history. While Private Henry Miller's mournful toll from the bell tower remains the most famous and persistent haunting at Fort Monroe, the old citadel, steeped in 2 centuries of war, disease, and emotional turmoil, is far from a one-ghost town. The sheer weight of history at Freedom's Fortress has seemingly anchored several other, lesser-known spirits to its stone ramparts, dark casemates, and historic buildings, creating a nexus of paranormal activity. Perhaps the second most frequently reported apparition is the Lady in White, believed to haunt the historic quarters number 1, once home to the fort's highest-ranking commanders, including figures like Robert E. Lee and Dwight D. Eisenhower. This spirit is described as a shimmering, ethereal woman in a flowing white gown, often seen gliding down the grand staircase or gazing out of the upper windows toward the sea. Unlike the sorrowful Miller, the Lady in White is said to carry an air of quiet melancholy and refinement. Local lore connects her to a tragic Civil War-era bride who waited in vain for her husband to return from battle, dying of a broken heart within the quarter's walls. Her haunting is characterized less by sound and more by visual stillness, a permanent fixture of elegant, enduring grief. Another prominent, localized haunting occurs within the dark, arched casemates, the fortified underground rooms designed to shelter troops and artillery. These oppressive spaces, particularly those nearest the old coastal batteries, are plagued by phantom sounds of distress. Soldiers and maintenance workers have often reported hearing the low, agonized cries of men, sometimes followed by the unmistakable metallic clanking of chains. This is widely attributed to the prisoners who were held here, particularly during the Civil War, most famously including Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who was confined in Casemate 2 for a time. The atmosphere in these rooms is heavy and suffocating, suggesting the intense, desperate suffering endured by those locked away beneath the massive stone walls. The historic chapel also holds its own mystery. Visitors and staff have consistently reported the faint, residual scent of old-fashioned pipe tobacco, and sometimes the faint murmur of a man's low humming, typically heard from the second-floor balcony where the minister often sat. This is often linked to an elderly chaplain who served at the fort for decades and was known to never miss a service, even into his frail final years. His presence is benevolent and comforting, a marked contrast to the despair emanating from the bell tower. Collectively, these varied hauntings paint a complete picture of Fort Monroe's spectral population. The presence of the Lady in White, the anguished prisoners in the casemates, and the faithful chaplain in the chapel all reinforce the unique and profound nature of Private Miller's trauma. He is not alone in his eternal vigil. He is but one soul in a community of restless spirits, each bound to Freedom's Fortress by their own specific, unfulfilled duty, enduring passion, or agonizing historical injustice. The bell tower ghost remains the loudest and most heartbreaking, but his story is simply the centerpiece of a deeply haunted and layered historical narrative. The story of Private Henry Miller, the disgraced sentinel whose guilt binds him to the bell tower, has transcended mere ghost story status. It has solidified into a permanent, integral local legend of Fort Monroe. This narrative, passed down through generations of soldiers, staff, and now park rangers, forms an indispensable layer of the fort's rich historical identity. The bell tower ghost is not just a figure of fear, but a cultural touchstone that embodies the fort's enduring themes of duty, failure, and the immense weight of honor. The persistence of the tale is driven by several factors. First, the physical evidence, the inexplicable tolling of the bell, is a repeated auditory confirmation that demands attention. Unlike ephemeral visual sightings, the sound is a measurable event that grounds the legend in physical reality, keeping the story fresh and terrifying for each new visitor and resident. Second, the story possesses a powerful human element, the tragedy of a young man destroyed not by combat, but by his own conscience. This emotional core resonates deeply, transforming the chilling figure into an object of pity rather than pure horror. As the fort transitioned from a military installation to a public national monument, the legend of Private Miller only grew stronger. It became a powerful tool for interpreting the site. Tour guides often begin their historical walks with the haunting, using Miller's story to illustrate the intense pressures of military life and the severe consequences of failure in the 19th century. The legend provides a crucial connection between the cold, inert stone and the hot, volatile emotions of the people who lived and served there. The bell tower is no longer just an observation post. It is perpetually marked as Miller's Post, a spot where the past is not simply remembered, but actively felt. The local community has fully embraced the ghost. During the autumn months, guided ghost tour focus on Miller's tragic saga, and local businesses often incorporate the Phantom Sentinel into their branding. This public acceptance ensures the story will never fade. The mystery remains, but the consensus has solidified. The ringing bell is the sound of Private Miller, and the cold spots are his despair. The haunting has become a form of emotional preservation, safeguarding the memory of a soldier whose life ended in disgrace, but whose spirit commands attention and sorrow centuries later. The story serves as a constant, somber reminder that history is not just about grand victories and famous figures. It is also about the forgotten, the disgraced, and the profound, personal failures that shaped individual lives. Private Miller's enduring mystery ensures that the most haunting aspect of Fort Monroe is not the fortifications built to withstand an enemy, but the enduring spirit of a soldier who could not withstand his own guilt. The enduring saga of the Bell Tower ghost transcends the simple thrill of a spectral tale. It serves as a powerful, somber reflection on America's military honor code and the sometimes forgotten human costs embedded in the nation's history. Private Henry Miller's haunting resonates so deeply because it speaks to the fundamental value placed on duty and integrity within the U.S. Armed Forces, a code so sacred that its violation could lead to eternal torment. His failure to maintain vigilance in 1867 was not just a historical incident. It became a supernatural parable about the immutable importance of the soldier's oath. Miller's story compels audiences to look beyond the grand narratives of victory and defeat that Fort Monroe represents, and to confront the deeply personal, often tragic, consequences of service. The fort is lauded as freedom's fortress for its role in emancipation. Yet Miller's ghost reminds visitors that alongside the heroes and the triumphs were the weak, the flawed, and the human failures who paid the highest psychological price. His disgrace, leading to suicide and eternal anguish, makes him a representative figure of the forgotten history. The stories that were too shameful or inconvenient for the official record, but which linger in the shadows and silence. The military sought to erase him through a dishonorable discharge and a quick, quiet burial, but the ghost's persistent tolling of the bell is his refusal to be forgotten. In this sense, the Bell Tower ghost is a unique historical sentinel. He is not guarding the fort against a physical enemy, but against the human impulse toward negligence and despair. He is a tragic monument to the principle that honor lost is a wound that can bind a soul far more effectively than any iron shackle. When the bell tolls inexplicably, it is the sound of history repeating a lesson, a non-verbal sermon on the enduring nature of guilt. The fort's present-day role as a national monument reinforces this resonance. Visitors come to Fort Monroe to touch the tangible past, yet they leave affected by the intangible. The ghost story ensures that the legacy of those who failed, those who suffered, and those who were erased from the official narrative are finally heard. Private Henry Miller's eternal vigil is thus a powerful and tragic contribution to the American story, a spectral embodiment of the notion that while stone citadels may stand for centuries, the honor of the soldiers who man them is what truly defines their enduring purpose.